The coffee was meant to save my company, not my life. I remember the exact way Vanessa smiled when she handed me the porcelain cup that morning. The steam curling between us like a secret she thought I would never uncover. It was barely 8:15 a.m. The winter light still pale across the marble kitchen counters of the home my late husband and I had built 37 years ago. I had a meeting in less than an hour, one that could decide the fate of Collins Artisan Bakeries, the business I had started with a single rented oven and a handwritten sign taped to a window on Main Street. At 68, I no longer rushed through mornings. I believed in quiet rituals. Warm coffee, buttered toast, the steady comfort of routine. Vanessa knew that. She had learned my habits the way an investor studies market patterns patiently, strategically. "You'll need your strength today," she said, placing the cup into my hands with a softness that almost felt sincere. Her nails were perfectly manicured in a pale pink that matched the silk blouse she wore, the picture of a supportive daughter-in-law. I noticed how her eyes lingered on me, not with affection but with calculation. My son Daniel had already left for the office, claiming an early conference call. He had kissed my cheek in that distracted way he'd developed over the past few years, as though I were a task he'd nearly forgotten to complete. I sat at the long breakfast table, the same one where Daniel used to do his homework while I balanced invoices and kneaded dough late into the night. The house felt too large now, its silence stretching like an unanswered question. I lifted the cup toward my lips. The aroma was slightly stronger than usual, bitter beneath the familiar roast I preferred. I remember thinking I should mention it. I remember deciding not to. Then it happened. Elena rushed in from the hallway, her sensible shoes squeaking faintly on the polished floor. She carried a stack of freshly pressed linens, her expression unusually tense. In one sudden motion that felt both clumsy and deliberate, she stumbled against the table. The cup flew from my hand. Dark coffee splashed across the ivory rug Vanessa had insisted we import from Italy, soaking into the fibers like ink spreading through a confession. For a heartbeat no one spoke. Vanessa's smile froze. Elena gasped and began apologizing in rapid Spanish, her hands trembling as she reached for a cloth. I felt a flicker of irritation, sharp and unexpected. That rug had cost more than my first bakery's yearly rent. "It's just coffee," I said, though my voice sounded distant even to me. Vanessa stepped closer, her perfume sweet and overwhelming. "I'll make you another," she offered quickly, too quickly. I waved her off. There wasn't time. The driver would arrive soon. I stood, smoothing the front of my navy wool suit, the one Daniel said made me look authoritative. As I walked toward the foyer, a strange heaviness pressed behind my eyes, like the onset of a storm. I paused, gripping the edge of the console table where framed photographs of happier years smiled back at me. Weddings, birthdays, flower-dusted afternoons when success still felt like a shared victory. The sensation passed. Or so I thought. During the car ride downtown, the city blurred beyond the tinted windows. Skyscrapers rose like silent judges. My phone buzzed with messages from board members eager for reassurance. The deal on the table was worth nearly $12 million. A lifetime's worth of early mornings and burned batches and stubborn faith, distilled into signatures waiting on crisp legal paper. I should have been focused. Instead, I found myself replaying the moment the cup slipped from my fingers. The way Vanessa had watched it fall. The way Elena had watched me. By the time we reached the glass tower that housed our corporate offices, my pulse had settled into an uneasy rhythm. The lobby's polished granite floors reflected a woman who looked composed, successful, entirely in control. I stepped into the elevator alone, pressing the button for the 22nd floor with steady hands. For the first time in decades, I felt as though I were walking into a room where the outcome had already been decided. What I didn't know then was that the coffee soaking into an Italian rug back at my house had just altered the trajectory of everything I believed about loyalty, ambition, and the quiet wars fought inside families. I also didn't know that somewhere behind me, in a kitchen that still smelled faintly of roasted beans and something far more dangerous, a maid was standing perfectly still, listening for the sound of sirens that had not yet been called. I realized something was wrong before I even stepped into the boardroom. It was not pain. It was not fear. It was a quiet disorientation that felt like my thoughts were moving through heavy syrup, slow and resistant. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime and the familiar scent of polished wood and fresh flowers greeted me. The kind of controlled elegance our headquarters had always projected. I had insisted on that design myself years ago. Clean lines, neutral colors, an atmosphere that set stability in a world that rarely offered it. Today, the hallway felt longer than usual. My heels echoed across the marble floor, each step deliberate, measured, as though I were rehearsing for a performance I did not remember agreeing to give. I paused outside the conference room and glanced at my reflection in the glass panel. My silver hair was perfectly styled. My navy suit sat sharply on my shoulders. From the outside, I looked like the woman who had built an empire out of flour and stubborn hope. Inside, something subtle was unraveling. When I pushed the door open, every conversation stopped. 8 faces turned toward me, polite smiles forming in practiced unison. Daniel sat at the far end of the table beside Vanessa, his posture rigid, his expression carefully neutral. Legal folders lay stacked in front of them like small, orderly verdicts. I took my seat slowly, placing my leather portfolio on the table. For a moment I could not remember why I had chosen that particular chair, the one closest to the window. Then I remembered. My husband had always liked the view. He used to say that success should never block out the sky. Vanessa leaned toward me, her voice warm enough to pass for concern. She asked if I was feeling well. I assured her that I was simply tired. That was true in more ways than one. The meeting began with numbers, projections, market expansion. Words that once sparked excitement now drifted past me like distant radio static. I noticed Daniel avoiding my eyes. I noticed Vanessa watching my hands as I flipped through the documents. I noticed how often she exchanged glances with the attorney seated to her left. It was a choreography I had not been invited to learn. At one point, the room tilted very slightly, as though someone had adjusted the foundation beneath my feet. I steadied myself by gripping the edge of the table. No one commented. They were too focused on the agenda, on the future they were already constructing without me. When the first contract was slid in my direction, the paper seemed unusually bright, almost reflective. I blinked and forced my vision to sharpen. $12 million. That was the valuation. A lifetime measured in tidy black numbers. Vanessa's manicured finger tapped gently beside the signature line. A silent cue. I smiled. It was a small, controlled smile, the kind that had carried me through supplier negotiations and economic downturns and sleepless nights with a feverish child. I told them I would need a moment. The restroom down the hall was cool and quiet, its fluorescent lighting mercilessly honest. I splashed water onto my wrists and watched it drip into the porcelain sink, clear and ordinary. My pulse fluttered beneath my skin like a trapped bird. For the first time that morning, a thought surfaced with startling clarity. If the coffee had not been spilled, I would have finished it. I would have walked into that meeting with whatever invisible weight it carried fully inside me. The realization did not frighten me. It steadied me. I dried my hands, straightened my jacket, and studied my reflection again. The woman staring back looked composed, alert, awake in a way she had not been 30 minutes earlier. When I returned to the conference room, Vanessa's relief was almost imperceptible, a slight softening around her eyes. She pushed another cup toward me, this one filled with herbal tea. I thanked her and left it untouched. Outside the window, clouds drifted across a pale blue sky, slow and patient. I took my seat and picked up the pen, feeling the weight of it settle into my fingers like a decision that had already begun forming somewhere deep within me. The pen felt heavier than it should have, as if the simple act of signing my name now carried consequences I could not yet measure. I let the silence stretch a few seconds longer than was comfortable. In my experience, people often reveal more when they believe they are waiting on you. Around the table, subtle movements began to surface. A board member cleared his throat. Another shifted a stack of documents that did not need adjusting. Vanessa folded her hands neatly, her posture composed, but her eyes never left my face. Daniel finally looked at me, really looked, and for the first time that morning I saw something flicker beneath his professional calm. It was not quite concern. It was closer to anticipation. I asked a simple question about the timing of the transfer. Nothing dramatic. Nothing confrontational. The attorney responded quickly, too quickly, outlining a schedule that sounded rehearsed rather than negotiated. My thoughts were clearer now, sharper than they had been since I stepped into the building. The earlier fog had lifted like mist burned away by sun. I set the pen down and turned a page, letting my fingertips rest on the smooth paper as though absorbing its intentions. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. She suggested that fatigue might be clouding my judgment and reminded everyone that we had discussed this plan extensively. Her tone was gentle, almost protective, the way one might speak about an elderly relative who needed guidance. A few heads nodded. I smiled again. It was becoming easier. I spoke about legacy, about responsibility, about how businesses are not only numbers but stories stitched together over decades. I watched the room carefully as I spoke. Most listened with polite patience. Vanessa listened with calculation. Daniel listened with something closer to dread. When I paused, the silence returned, heavier now, more deliberate. I could sense that the narrative they had prepared was beginning to drift off script. I reached into my portfolio and withdrew a small leather notebook, its edges worn from years of use. Inside were handwritten notes I had made the night before, fragments of memory that had refused to settle into sleep. Phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. Financial summaries that arrived pre-highlighted as though my attention span needed managing. Invitations to meetings that were suddenly rescheduled without explanation. I did not accuse anyone. I simply asked for clarification. One by one the answers came. Polished. Reasonable. Slightly inconsistent. Outside the window a line of gray clouds gathered over the skyline, dimming the afternoon light. The herbal tea Vanessa had placed near my elbow remained untouched, its steam long since vanished. I became aware of the quiet rhythm of my own breathing, steady and controlled. Whatever had been intended for me that morning had failed to reach its destination. That fact settled inside me with unexpected calm. I told them I would not be signing anything today. The reaction was immediate though carefully restrained. The attorney adjusted his glasses. A board member began speaking about market volatility. Vanessa's smile tightened at the corners, almost imperceptibly. Daniel's jaw flexed. I rose from my chair, smoothing invisible creases from my skirt. I thanked them for their time. I assured them that important decisions required clear minds, and that mine had only just begun to clear. As I walked toward the door, I felt the weight of their attention follow me like a draft. In the hallway the air seemed cooler, freer. My phone vibrated in my handbag. A single message waited on the screen. It was from Elena. 3 words. Do not trust her. I stood there for a moment, watching employees move briskly past with laptops and takeaway coffees, the ordinary machinery of success humming all around me. Somewhere behind that polished efficiency, a quieter story was unfolding, one that would demand patience, observation, and a willingness to see the people closest to me without the comfort of old illusions. I pressed the elevator button and allowed myself a slow breath. Whatever game had begun that morning was far from over, and for the first time since my husband's death, I felt fully awake inside it. I did not go home immediately. Instead, I asked the driver to take the long way around the river, the route my husband used to prefer when he needed time to think. The late afternoon sun rested low on the horizon, turning the water into a sheet of muted gold. I watched the reflection of passing bridges ripple across the tinted window, and allowed the quiet to settle around me like a protective coat. Elena's message stayed open on my phone, those 3 words pulsing with a gravity that felt both alarming and oddly reassuring. Do not trust her. I replayed the morning with deliberate care, the way I used to review baking failures until I understood exactly where the dough had gone wrong. Vanessa's smile. The bitterness beneath the coffee's familiar scent. The urgency with which she had offered to replace the cup. None of it had seemed dramatic in isolation. Together, it formed a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. When we finally turned onto the tree-lined street leading to my house, a memory surfaced with such clarity that I almost spoke it aloud. Vanessa had begun insisting on preparing my breakfast only weeks after my husband's funeral. At the time, I had interpreted it as kindness, a younger woman stepping into the quiet spaces grief had hollowed out. Now I wondered whether it had been something else entirely. The car rolled to a stop in front of the iron gates, their black bars casting long shadows across the gravel driveway. I stepped out slowly, the crisp winter air sharpening my thoughts. Inside, the house felt unusually still, as though it were holding its breath. Elena was waiting in the kitchen, her posture straight, her expression composed in a way I had never seen before. She did not rush toward me with apologies or explanations. She simply gestured toward the small breakfast table where a fresh pot of coffee sat untouched beside a folded linen cloth. For a moment we regarded one another in silence. I realized then how little I truly knew about the woman who had been quietly maintaining my home for nearly 8 years. She spoke first, choosing her words carefully. She told me she had seen Vanessa in the kitchen earlier that morning, standing by the counter with a small vial held between her fingers. She had not understood what it was at first. She only understood that Vanessa had not expected anyone to be watching. I listened without interruption, feeling the slow click of realization settling into place. Elena admitted that she had not known how to confront me directly. She feared she would be dismissed or worse, dismissed in front of Vanessa. So she had done the only thing she believed might protect me in the moment. She had caused an accident. The word sounded strangely inadequate for the possibility it concealed. I moved to the counter and lifted the porcelain cup that had been replaced after I left. Its rim was perfectly clean. Its contents perfectly still. I did not drink. Instead, I asked Elena if she could remember the name printed on the vial. She hesitated, then nodded. The syllables sounded clinical, unfamiliar. Something that belonged in hospital corridors rather than family kitchens. I wrote it down in my leather notebook with a steadiness that surprised me. Outside, the wind stirred the bare branches of the maple trees lining the yard, their shadows flickering across the tiled floor. I thanked Elena in a voice that felt older than my years. Not for loyalty. Not yet. For attention. For noticing what others had chosen to overlook. As she returned to her tasks, the quiet resumed its patient vigil. I stood alone in the kitchen that had once been the warm center of my marriage, and understood that whatever had begun as subtle maneuvering was evolving into something far more deliberate. The game was no longer about business decisions or inheritance schedules. It was about control. About perception. About who would be believed when the story finally reached its inevitable audience. I closed my notebook and slipped it into my bag. Tomorrow I would begin verifying what Elena had seen. Tonight I would play the part that had been written for me. The grieving widow grateful for help. The aging founder ready to step aside. Some roles are most powerful when performed convincingly, and I had spent a lifetime learning how to make difficult performances look effortless. The next morning, I woke before dawn with the peculiar clarity that often follows the acceptance of an uncomfortable truth. The house was still wrapped in shadows, its familiar shape softened by the blue-gray light that filtered through the curtains. For years, mornings had belonged to hope and routine. Today they belonged to strategy. I dressed slowly, choosing a soft cashmere sweater instead of the tailored suits that had once been my armor. The role I intended to play required subtlety. When I entered the kitchen, Vanessa was already there. She stood by the counter with her back to me, stirring something in a ceramic mug as though she had been rehearsing the gesture for hours. The scent of cinnamon drifted through the air. She turned with a bright smile that did not reach her eyes. She asked how I had slept. I told her the truth. Better than I had in weeks. Her relief was quick but carefully disguised. Daniel joined us moments later, his tie slightly crooked, his expression preoccupied. He spoke about market pressures, about how the board was anxious, about how he only wanted what was best for me. I listened with the patience of someone who had once believed those words without question. Vanessa placed a cup of herbal tea into my hands. I thanked her warmly and carried it to the breakfast table, letting the steam curl upward like a quiet signal. Elena moved through the room with practiced efficiency, wiping surfaces that were already clean, refilling a bowl of fruit that no one intended to eat. Our eyes met only once. It was enough. I took a careful sip. The taste was mild, unremarkable. I set the cup down after a moment and began speaking about fatigue, about how the responsibilities of leadership felt heavier now than they had even a year ago. Daniel leaned forward immediately, concern sharpening his voice. Vanessa placed her hand gently on his arm, the picture of supportive calm. She suggested that perhaps it was time to consider a more formal transition plan. I nodded as though the idea had only just occurred to me. The conversation unfolded exactly as I suspected it might. Words like guardianship and medical evaluation surfaced in tones meant to sound protective. I allowed my shoulders to slump slightly, I let my gaze drift toward the window as though searching for thoughts that would not come. Inside, my mind recorded every detail with precise attention. After breakfast, I retreated to my study and closed the door with deliberate softness. The room still smelled faintly of leather and old paper, the scent of decisions made in solitude. I opened my notebook and wrote down the name Elena had given me the night before. Then I called a physician I trusted, a woman who had once been a loyal customer when my first bakery barely broke even. She agreed to meet me privately that afternoon. The hours that followed moved with unusual stillness. Vanessa checked on me twice, offering tea, offering company, offering the kind of kindness that feels rehearsed when one begins to notice its timing. I accepted everything with gratitude. I spoke slowly. I forgot small details on purpose. When Daniel asked about the contracts from yesterday, I confessed that the numbers had blurred together in my mind. His silence lasted just long enough to confirm my suspicions. By late afternoon, I found myself seated in a quiet examination room painted a shade of pale green meant to soothe anxious patients. The physician listened carefully as I described the morning, the spilled coffee, the strange heaviness that had followed. She did not dismiss my concerns. Instead, she suggested a series of discrete tests. Blood work. Toxicology screening. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would raise alarm. As she handed me the paperwork, I felt an unexpected surge of gratitude for the years I had spent building relationships based on mutual respect rather than convenience. Trust, I realized, was the only true currency that held its value in moments like this. When I returned home that evening, Vanessa greeted me with the same composed warmth, her questions light, her attention unwavering. I told her the appointment had simply been routine. She smiled and poured me another cup of tea. This time I did not drink at all. Instead, I held the warm porcelain between my palms and watched the sky darken beyond the kitchen windows, understanding that the performance had truly begun, and that every gesture from now on would carry the quiet weight of survival. The results arrived 2 days later in an unmarked envelope that felt far heavier than its thin paper should have allowed. I had been sitting in the sunroom when the courier rang the bell, the winter light spilling across the hardwood floors in long pale stripes. For a moment, I considered leaving the envelope unopened, preserving the fragile comfort of uncertainty. Instead, I placed it on the small glass table beside my chair and continued stirring the tea I had no intention of drinking. Across the room, Vanessa was arranging fresh flowers with meticulous care, trimming each stem as though precision itself could guarantee beauty. Daniel was on a conference call in his father's old office, his voice muffled but tense. The house moved around me like a stage set, every gesture rehearsed, every silence intentional. When I finally broke the seal, the faint scent of antiseptic clung to the documents inside. Clinical language filled the page. Measured conclusions. Evidence of substances that did not belong in the bloodstream of a healthy woman who had consumed nothing more than breakfast. I read each line twice. Not because I doubted the findings, but because I needed to absorb the calm certainty with which they were presented. My pulse remained steady. Fear had already done its work and left behind something cooler. Something useful. I folded the papers neatly and slipped them into my notebook just as Vanessa approached with a bright smile and a question about dinner plans. I told her I was thinking of inviting Daniel to discuss succession strategies. Her eyes flickered, a brief spark of satisfaction she could not entirely conceal. That evening I allowed my performance to deepen. I misplaced my reading glasses on purpose. I asked Daniel to repeat a conversation we had already finished. I spoke about exhaustion in a tone that sounded almost apologetic. Vanessa listened with gentle concern, offering to handle more responsibilities at the company. She mentioned very casually that the board had begun to worry about continuity.
Il hängt her for her devotion.
The word tasted strange in my mouth. Later, alone in my study, I reviewed the company's financial records with a focus sharpened by quiet determination. Transfers had been made over the past 6 months, subtle adjustments that would have escaped my notice under ordinary circumstances. Consulting fees routed through shell partnerships. Strategic investments approved during meetings I had apparently missed. Each discovery felt like another piece sliding into a puzzle that had been assembled without my consent. Elena knocked softly on the door just before midnight, bringing a tray with chamomile tea and a folded note. She did not speak. She did not need to. The note contained a date and a time, along with the name of a security firm I recognized from previous corporate audits. I understood immediately that she had been paying attention far longer than I had realized. Gratitude rose in me, quiet and profound. The following morning, I asked Vanessa if she would accompany me to the office later that week. I explained that I wanted her to begin presenting herself as my successor. Her delight was genuine now, unguarded in its intensity. Daniel watched us both with an expression I could not quite decipher, as though he sensed a shift in gravity but did not yet understand its direction. I moved through the day with deliberate fragility, resting more often, speaking less. Inside, my thoughts moved with precise clarity. Survival is rarely dramatic. It unfolds in measured decisions, in the willingness to appear weaker than one truly is. As dusk settled over the house, I stood at the kitchen window and watched the reflection of our three figures merge in the dark glass. For years, I had believed that building a legacy meant trusting those who would inherit it. Now I understood that legacy, like life itself, sometimes demanded the courage to confront the quiet betrayals that gather in the spaces where love once felt unquestionable. The morning of the next board meeting arrived with a stillness that felt almost ceremonial. I woke before the alarm, the sky outside my bedroom window still washed in a deep pre-dawn blue. For a moment I lay there listening to the quiet hum of the house, the same house that had once echoed with laughter, arguments, and the comforting noise of a family certain of its future. Today, every sound seemed deliberate, every silence meaningful. I dressed with careful intention, choosing a charcoal suit that balanced authority with the subtle suggestion of fragility. Vanessa had insisted on accompanying me, her excitement disguised as dutiful concern. She hovered in the doorway while I fastened my earrings, offering to carry my portfolio as though I might forget where I had placed it. I thanked her with a gentle smile. Daniel joined us downstairs, his expression unreadable, his tie perfectly straight for the first time in weeks. The drive downtown unfolded in near silence. Traffic lights blinked from red to green with mechanical indifference. Pedestrians hurried across crosswalks clutching paper cups of coffee, unaware that entire empires could pivot on mornings like this. When we reached the office tower, Vanessa stepped out of the car before the driver could open her door, smoothing her coat as though stepping onto a stage she had rehearsed for years. I followed at a slower pace, allowing the cool air to steady my breathing. Inside the elevator, our reflections stood side by side in the mirrored walls, three figures bound by blood and ambition, and something far more complicated. Vanessa spoke about presentation slides and investor confidence. Daniel nodded at appropriate intervals. I watched the numbers climb above the door, and felt the calm certainty of a plan moving toward its moment. The conference room was already full when we entered. Familiar faces greeted me with polite warmth that could not quite conceal their curiosity. Rumors had a way of traveling faster than official announcements. I took my usual seat near the window, placing my notebook beside a neatly stacked set of documents. Vanessa remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, acknowledging the room with a confidence that bordered on triumph. The meeting began with routine updates, sales forecasts, expansion timelines. Words that once ignited passion now felt like markers in a carefully choreographed performance. When it was Vanessa's turn to speak, she rose with graceful composure and began outlining a transition strategy designed to protect the company from what she described as my increasing fatigue. Her tone was compassionate, almost reverent. She spoke of continuity, of safeguarding legacy, of ensuring that emotional attachments did not cloud responsible leadership. Daniel added measured comments about market stability, his voice steady but lacking its former conviction. I listened without interruption, my hands folded lightly in my lap. Around the table, attention shifted from speaker to listener, from future to present. Vanessa concluded by suggesting that the board consider initiating formal steps to evaluate my capacity to continue in my role. The words landed softly, like snow that accumulates without warning. For several seconds no one spoke. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for denial, for anger, for the predictable defenses of someone cornered by time. Instead, I reached for my notebook and opened it with unhurried precision. Inside lay the folded pages that had already begun to alter the narrative being constructed in that room. I did not present them yet. Timing, I had learned, was often the difference between truth ignored and truth that could no longer be dismissed. Outside the window, the city stretched toward the horizon in quiet defiance of individual dramas. I rose slowly, acknowledging the board with a nod that carried more resolve than resignation. Vanessa's gaze flickered with uncertainty for the first time that morning. Daniel's hand tightened around his pen. In that suspended moment between accusation and revelation, I understood that survival was not only about proving what had been done. It was about choosing exactly when the world would be forced to see it. The silence that followed my decision to stand felt heavier than any accusation could have been. For a brief moment, I allowed the stillness to settle across the room like dust disturbed by an unseen movement. Vanessa remained poised near the end of the conference table, her confidence beginning to fray at the edges in ways only careful observation could detect. Daniel's gaze moved between us with growing unease, as though he were watching a storm form in clear skies. I placed both hands lightly on the polished wood surface and spoke in a tone that carried neither anger nor fear. I said that before any evaluation of my capacity could be discussed, there were matters of clarity that deserved equal attention. I opened my notebook and withdrew the first folded document. The faint rustle of paper sounded louder than it should have in that controlled environment. I slid the pages across the table toward the board chair, who adjusted his glasses and began reading with visible concentration. One by one, other members leaned forward, curiosity replacing their earlier assumptions. Vanessa did not move. She watched their expressions instead, as though searching for cues that would tell her which role to play next. I explained calmly that recent medical tests had revealed substances in my system that could impair cognition and physical stability. I did not accuse anyone by name. I simply described the timeline, the morning coffee, the sudden heaviness, the persistence of symptoms that could not be attributed to age or fatigue. A murmur moved through the room like a low current. Daniel's hand tightened around the back of his chair. Vanessa's smile returned, thinner now, sharpened by the necessity of response. She suggested that stress could create similar reactions. She offered to arrange independent testing to ensure fairness. I nodded as though her concern were welcome. Then I produced the second set of documents, financial records marked with discrete annotations. Transfers approved during periods when I had reportedly been too tired to attend meetings. Consulting agreements signed electronically from devices that had never left this building. The board chair's expression shifted from polite interest to unmistakable alarm. Outside the window, clouds gathered in slow formation, dimming the afternoon light until the city seemed suspended in a gray pause. I spoke about stewardship, about how leadership required transparency, even when truths proved uncomfortable. Vanessa took a step forward, her composure wavering just enough to reveal urgency beneath the practiced calm. She insisted that any irregularities were misunderstandings. Daniel finally spoke, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. He asked for time to review everything. I agreed. Time, after all, had become my most reliable ally. Before sitting down again, I reached into my portfolio and placed a small envelope at the center of the table. Inside were still images taken from security footage Elena had quietly secured through the firm she had named. Grainy frames captured familiar shapes in an unfamiliar context. A kitchen counter, a porcelain cup, a hand holding something small and indistinct. No drama, no confrontation, only implication waiting for acknowledgement. The room seemed to contract around those silent images. I returned to my seat and folded my hands, allowing the weight of evidence to speak in ways emotion never could. Vanessa remained standing, the lines of her posture rigid with calculation. Daniel lowered his gaze to the table as though searching for answers in the wood grain. For the first time since this quiet war had begun, I sensed that the narrative had shifted beyond their control. Outside, the first drops of rain traced delicate paths down the glass, blurring the skyline into soft uncertainty. I watched them fall and understood that revelation rarely arrives like thunder. More often, it gathers patiently, until even the most carefully constructed illusions can no longer withstand its steady persistence. Rain continued to trace slow, uncertain paths down the conference room windows long after the final document had been read. No one rushed to speak. No one reached for their phone or their neatly arranged folders. The illusion of control that had filled the room earlier now felt fragile, like glassware left too close to the edge of a table. I remained seated with my hands folded lightly in my lap, watching the quiet realization spread across familiar faces. The board chair cleared his throat first, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility rather than accusation. He suggested an immediate internal review, independent oversight, and the temporary suspension of any transition discussions until clarity could be restored. Vanessa responded with practiced composure, her tone measured, her posture unwavering. She spoke of loyalty and misunderstanding, of how easily narratives can be manipulated when fear takes hold. For a moment I almost admired her discipline. Then Daniel stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not defend anyone. He simply asked whether the security footage could be verified by a third party. I nodded and slid a small card across the table bearing the name of the firm Elena had contacted. The room seemed to exhale all at once. Decisions followed quickly after that. Not dramatic ones. Not final ones. But enough to alter the direction of every plan that had been quietly unfolding without me. Vanessa gathered her notes with steady hands, though the faint tremor in her fingers betrayed the effort required to maintain control. She left the room before the meeting formally concluded, her heels striking the marble hallway with a rhythm that echoed long after she disappeared from view. Daniel remained behind. He sat down heavily as though gravity had suddenly remembered him. For the first time in years, he looked less like an executive and more like the boy who used to wait for me after school with flour on his sleeves from helping in the bakery. He asked why I had not told him sooner. I answered honestly. Trust, once fractured, requires evidence before it can be discussed. Outside, the rain softened into a fine mist, blurring the edges of the city into something gentler than certainty. In the weeks that followed, investigations moved forward with quiet efficiency. Accounts were audited, timelines reconstructed, conversations revisited with the clarity that hindsight demands. I did not seek confrontation. I did not seek vindication. I focused instead on restoring the stability that thousands of employees depended upon. Vanessa resigned before any formal conclusions were announced, citing personal reasons and the need for distance. Her departure was swift, her presence erased from corporate directories and family calendars with equal discretion. Daniel began arriving at my office earlier each morning, asking questions he had once assumed he already understood. We spoke about legacy in ways we never had before, not as an inheritance to be claimed but as a responsibility to be earned. At home, the kitchen returned to its quieter rhythms. Elena moved through the rooms with the same attentive grace, her role unchanged yet somehow transformed. One evening I handed her a small set of keys and told her she would never again need to worry about whether she had a place in this house. She accepted them with a nod that carried more gratitude than words could manage. Months later, on a clear spring morning, I signed a different set of papers in that same conference room by the window. This time the decision was entirely mine. I restructured ownership, secured protections that would outlast my tenure, and announced a leadership transition built on transparency rather than urgency. When the meeting ended, I stood alone for a moment, watching sunlight replace the memory of rain on the glass. Survival, I had learned, does not always arrive as triumph. Sometimes it arrives as quiet continuation, as the steady rebuilding of trust, as the simple freedom to walk out of a room knowing that the story now belongs to you. I closed my notebook, placed it carefully into my bag, and stepped into the hallway where the future waited with a patience I was finally prepared to meet.